Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations warning more than 50,000 Palestinian children in Gaza require immediate medical treatment for acute malnutrition. In a statement, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees said the situation in Gaza is catastrophic as residents continue to face desperate levels of hunger. Muslims across the world today are marking the holy day of Eid al-Adha, but it is a day of mourning in Gaza, where the death toll from Israel's war has topped 37,300.
How are we supposed to be happy on Eid, while every day there are martyrs, wounded people every minute, every second? There are no houses. This area used to be the best area in Khan Yunis. Now it's all destruction and rubble. Now our biggest dream is to live in a house. There are no houses and no life. Life has been diminished.
A new investigation by the Associated Press has revealed at least 60 Palestinian families have lost 25 or more family members in Israel's ongoing war. In some cases, entire bloodlines of families have been killed. AP highlights the story of Yusuf Salem. 173 of his relatives were killed in Israeli airstrikes in December. About 100 more members of his family have died since then. Yusuf Salem told the AP, quote, "My uncles were wiped out totally, the heads of households, their wives, children, and grandchildren," unquote. In more news from Gaza, aid shipments are no longer coming in by sea to Gaza. The U.S. military's temporarily removed the pier it just built due to rough seas at the cost of over $300 million, the building of that pier. This comes just over a week after the pier was reattached after the first pier was damaged in a storm. Meanwhile, on Sunday, Israel announced it would pause attacks along an aid route in southern Gaza during daylight hours, but the head of UNRWA says operationally nothing's changed in southern Gaza. Israel's announcement came a day after fighters from Hamas killed 8 Israeli soldiers in Rafah in an ambush. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved Israel's war cabinet following the recent resignation of former military chief Benny Gantz. This comes as mass protests continue in Israel, calling for the government to support a ceasefire and hostage deal and for new elections. Tens of thousands of people protested in Tel Aviv Saturday. Several groups have vowed to intensify their protests by launching what they call a week of resistance. Here in the United States, Democratic Congressmember Ro Khanna of California has announced he'll join other lawmakers and boycott Netanyahu's upcoming speech to Congress. The Biden administration's placed sanctions on a far-right Israeli group that's been attacking Gaza-bound humanitarian aid trucks in the West Bank. In May, members of the group Tzav 9 set fire to 2 aid trucks and looted the aid aboard the trucks. In other news from the occupied West Bank, Norway's foreign minister has warned the Palestinian Authority could collapse in the coming months due to a lack of funding. In a 6-3 ruling, the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down a ban on bump stocks, accessories that turn semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15 into fully automatic machine guns. The Trump administration issued the ban in 2018 after a gunman opened fire at a concert in Las Vegas, killing 58 people in one of the country's deadliest mass shootings ever. In the majority opinion, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote, quote, "We hold that a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not a machine gun because it cannot fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger," unquote. The court's 3 liberal judges dissented. Justice Sonia Sotomayor summarized her dissent from the bench, saying, quote, "The majority puts machine guns back in civilian hands. When I see a bird that walks like a duck, swims like a duck, quacks like a duck, I call that bird a duck," she said. Survivors of the 2017 Las Vegas massacre decried the Supreme Court decision.
Going to let our children continue to die. You know, that's my biggest push, is that as an adult, I am stuck with this trauma and this fear for the rest of my life. My children should not have to live this way. You know, we don't have to live this way, and we don't have to die this way.
In related news, a gunman in Rochester Hills, Michigan, opened fire at a splash pad on Saturday afternoon. 9 people were injured, including 2 children and a pregnant woman. The victims ranged in age from 4 to 78. A semi-automatic handgun was found at the scene. The suspected gunman was later found dead from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. The shooting occurred in the same county as the 2021 mass shooting at Oxford High School that left 4 students dead. More than 90 countries participated in a 2-day conference in Switzerland to discuss ways to end Russia's war in Ukraine, but Russia wasn't invited to attend the talks. Most of the countries attending signed a joint communiqué stating the, quote, territorial integrity of Ukraine must be the basis of any peace deal. Ahead of the talks, Russian President Vladimir Putin put forward his own ceasefire proposal that involved Ukraine dropping its ambitions to join NATO and to hand over areas of Ukraine claimed by Moscow. Speaking in Switzerland, Vice President Kamala Harris criticized Putin's offer.
And let nothing about the end of this war be decided without Ukraine. By contrast, however, yesterday, Putin put forward a proposal. But we must speak truth. He is not calling for negotiations. He is calling for surrender.
The UN is imploring the international community to pay more attention to the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan, where the war that broke out last April has killed at least 14,000 people, uprooted over 10 million, could result in millions of famine-related deaths. Humanitarian groups project 750,000 people could face catastrophic food shortages by September, while some analysts say the death toll could end up in the millions. This comes amidst ongoing deadly battles in El Fasher as the Rapid Support Forces try to seize the last city in Darfur outside its control. Over 220 people have been killed in recent fighting. Last week, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling on the RSF to immediately halt its attack on El Fasher. In France, leftist parties announced a new alliance ahead of snap elections later this month. French President Emmanuel Macron called the surprise June 30th vote after suffering a major defeat to the far-right National Rally at the EU elections. Leaders of the newly formed New Popular Front joined mass protests against the rise of the far right in Paris Saturday, vowing a complete break with Macron's policies.
Popular mobilization is the key to fight against the extreme right and to beat the extreme right. We say regularly that the European elections mark the after-Macron period.
The United States is driving a global surge in spending on nuclear weapons. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons reports global spending on nukes jumped 13% to over $91 billion last year. The United States spent over $51 billion modernizing its nuclear arsenal. That's more money than all of the other nuclear nations spent last year combined. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has been re-elected for a second term after his African National Congress managed to put together South Africa's first coalition government. The coalition includes the Democratic Alliance, the ANC's longtime rival. The ANC suffered a major defeat in the recent election when it lost its majority in parliament for the first time since the end of apartheid 30 years ago. Reuters has revealed the U.S. military ran a secret anti-vaccination campaign during the pandemic in the Philippines and other nations in an effort to sow doubt about COVID vaccines made by China. The Pentagon campaign began in 2020 under Donald Trump and continued into mid-2021 after Joe Biden took office. The Pentagon set up numerous fake social media accounts on multiple platforms to target audiences in the Philippines, Central Asia, and the Middle East. The campaign also aimed to discredit masks and test kits made in China. One military officer involved in the campaign told Reuters, quote, "We weren't looking at this from a public health perspective. We were looking at how we could drag China through the mud," they said. A judge in Missouri has overturned the conviction of a woman who spent 43 years in prison for a murder she did not commit. 63-year-old Sandra Hem is believed to have been jailed longer than any other woman who was wrongfully convicted in the United States. She was convicted of killing a librarian in 1980 solely based on self-incriminating statements she made to police at a time when she was a patient at a psychiatric hospital where she was being treated for auditory hallucinations, and drug use. Evidence has since emerged showing the actual murderer was a police officer who has since died. The governor of Maryland is planning today to pardon 175,000 marijuana convictions. The sweeping move by Governor Wes Moore is expected to help about 100,000 people who were arrested on low-level drug charges. In an interview with the Washington Post, Governor Moore said, quote, "I'm ecstatic that we have a real opportunity with what I'm signing to right a lot of historical wrongs," unquote. Governor Moore said he timed pardons for the week of Juneteenth, the federal holiday on June 19th to mark the end of slavery in the United States. The U.S. Surgeon General is calling on Congress to require social media platforms to include warnings stating that their apps can cause, quote, "significant mental health harms for adolescents," unquote. In an op-ed for the New York Times, Dr. Vivek Murthy wrote, quote, "Evidence from tobacco studies show that warning labels can increase awareness and change behavior." Climate activists in Europe are denouncing G7 leaders for not doing more to address the climate emergency. During the recent summit in Italy, G7 leaders committed to accelerating the transition away from fossil fuels. Activists with the group Extinction Rebellion chained themselves together in Bari, Italy.
We call for this voice to be heard, that of the animals that are disappearing, of the biodiversity that is dying, and also of the people who are living in the front line of the eco-climate crisis. Because international forums such as the G7 are not taking concrete action. Instead, they're going in the opposite direction. Even though international institutes such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the International Energy Agency have repeatedly said that a transition is possible, even while respecting the rights of people and workers. G7 countries continue to invest in fossil gas, like Italy, in oil, like the U.S., in coal, like Japan or France and Germany.
And the University of Minnesota has announced it'll launch a new search for the next director of its Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies after rescinding its offer to noted historian Professor Raz Siegel. The center revoked its job offer to Siegel, who is an Israeli Jew, after 2 members of its advisory board resigned to protest his hiring, who has called Israel's war on Gaza, quote, "a textbook case of genocide." Hundreds of professors have signed a letter condemning the university's decision. You can see our interview with Professor Siegel at democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.